Okay, so today I'll be exploring the two Gothic texts, that of Coraline and The Raven by Alan Edgar Poe. Okay, so to get right into it, The Raven is a narrative poem by the American writer Edgar Poe. So it was first published in January of 1845. So the poem is often noted for its stylistic language and supernatural atmosphere. So to give a brief overview of the story, at midnight, the poem speaker hears a tapping on his door. When he opens the window, a raven flies in. So the speaker then asks the raven if he'll be able to see his long-lost lover Lenore again, and the raven cries, "Nevermore." The speaker descends into madness due to his depression, uncertainty, loneliness, and isolation. So the central messages in this text and the meanings is that you should let go. So you cannot hold on to the things and the people that you love forever, and that if you don't let go, it will bring you pain and suffering. So the theme of insanity is also emphasized, and this is through the internal darkness that the protagonist faces. It can be assumed then that the man has descended into madness and irreversible and permanent insanity. This brings out a message of how grief can affect someone so much, and it really places emphasis on these emotions and that it's okay to be experiencing these feelings of grief. Okay, so how my quote relates. So my quote is, "Give them pleasure, the same pleasure they have when they wake up from a nightmare," by Alfred Hitchcock. So in The Raven, as he is falling asleep, in his journey of overcoming grief, his imagination takes control of him in a desire to see his deceased lover, Lenore. When we wake up from a nightmare, there is a sense of utter relief. So according to a phrase from the poem, deep into that madness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming, dreams no mortal would ever dare to dream before. This explains how intense his grief is, and it's like living in a nightmare and a dream that he wants to wake up from. And when it goes into the detail, that it is actually very sad. So nightmares, as we know, are figments of our imagination, and the theme of supernatural does relate to this quote. This is done through supernatural elements that can be so powerful that they may be figments of our imagination. The raven is given the ability to speak, and this is, of course, brings out the literary device of personification, that it's all in his imagination. The raven isn't really talking to us, and this brings out, the madness, and this relates to the quote through dreaming in a nightmare as he feels as though he's living in a nightmare. So our literary devices and themes in The Raven. So Poe has used a various literary device to make his poem as extraordinary as it is, and this helps the reader to interpret the poem. One of these themes is alienation and loneliness. This is a result, as we know, of the speaker's loss of Lenore. This literary device that most conveys this theme is repetition. For example, the name Lenore is used over and over again. This is so that the reader is always aware of the speaker's sense of love and loss. So nothing more is also repeated. For example, "'Tis the wind and nothing more." That is an example from the poem. So this idea of nothing more can also infer that with Lenore gone, there is nothing else, nothing more to his life, that he feels empty. Lenore is the feeling that the protagonist is missing. So soon this phrase is replaced with the repetition of nevermore, here we can see an even deeper sense of loss that will last the rest of his life. Personification is a device that gives human attributes to non-living things and animals, such as, like an example is, "Quoth the raven nevermore." This way, quoth, meaning speak. The raven is given the ability to speak. This relates to the central messages through the raven's ability to speak, and it replying nevermore to all of the protagonist's utterance. It bears the grief and harsh reality that the protagonists face. Internal rhyme scheme is another example of a literary device. So an example of this is through the words dreary and weary in the same sentence. Another example is, "While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping." This relates, as I said, to the quote where he's napping and he's dreaming. Okay, so I'll talk about now about the text that I chose. So it's the story of Coraline. So the story of Coraline is set with a young girl who explores her new home while she discovers a secret door, behind which lies an alternate world. This closely mirrors her own, but in many ways she finds better. Her mother and parallel family try to keep her there forever. She must use all of her resources and bravery to make it back to her family and ordinary life. While Coraline discovers that her parents are in danger and that the other mother in the alternate universe is using her, she realizes that she needs to accept people and the way things are, and that nothing is perfect, and nor is she. So the target audience of this is young children, and it's really interesting how the director Henry Schlick uses Coraline as a lesson for the parents who don't have enough time for their children. It also leads children to understand the importance of family life and social bonds, that not all family is perfect, and that all families have their struggles, and that's okay. So in a way, it normalizes young children's, family conflict and family tension, which is, I think, something is very positive. So she is brave and courageous, and the theme and message of courage becomes clear. So Coraline saves the eyes of the ghost children and goes back into the other world and challenges the mother to a game. So that brings out the message of being courageous. So how the quote relates. So the quote relates just like how it did with the Raven, the concept of imagination. So the quote refers to the nightmare and a feeling of waking up from a nightmare, as I mentioned, and nightmares being a form of imagination. So Coraline, being ambitious and adventurous, she discovers a new imaginary world by accident. So just like in The Raven, it could be said that it's all a figure of her imagination. So she's still a child still, and as we know, children tend to have a big imagination. And I think that this may be a technique that the author uses to bring out these underlying messages, how she's all imagining it, but it just brings out the importance of family and social bonds and, just being grateful for what you have. So this brings me to literary devices. So I have compared and contrasted these. So ones that we find evident in The Raven and in Coraline is the example of personification. So having the ability to talk in both of them. So in Coraline, it's the cat. So the cat possesses human qualities, including sarcasm and emotion. Another one that is evident in both of them is symbolism. So symbolism in The Raven was about how the Raven is a symbol of his grief and his insanity. And then symbolism in Coraline is the button in the eyes, as we can see in the photo. It says that the eyes are a window to one's soul. So by the mother taking the children's eyes and sewing buttons to them, it's a way to keep their souls with her and therefore trapped in the other world. So it actually has some pretty dark meaning. So in terms of literary devices that are indifferent from each other in between both of these texts are mood and tone and foreshadowing. So mood and tone, so Coraline is ominous and the story really gets sharp and direct to the point. As The Raven, as we can see with the way that it's presented, it's more passionate in the way that it's delivered. It's more about the emotions rather than straight to the point. So another literary device that is indifferent is foreshadowing. So Miss Forcible and Miss Spink read the tea leaves at the bottom of Coraline's cup, and they discover that she's in great danger. So that foreshadows the whole plot of the text, and we don't see the sense of foreshadowing in The Raven. Okay, so this brings me to similarities between both the texts. So as I mentioned before with the literary device, they both have personification of the Raven being able to speak and the cat being able to possess human qualities. So they both also have Gothic undertones of supernatural, of course. So of the Raven is through speaking and presenting the narrator's grief. So in Coraline, it's the clause that leads to an altered universe, and this is a depiction of supernatural. So both texts show the theme of courage in being strong as something that is similar. So The Raven shows courage in attempting to overcome grief and remaining strong while losing somebody loved, despite how tough it can be. Coraline, as mentioned, shows courage through saving the eyes of the ghost children and going back into the universe. Coraline as a young girl has courage by nature. And in the narrator in The Raven, he shows courage by trying to overcome and just living with the grief that he does. Another example is learning to be independent. So the man in The Raven has to learn to live without his loved one, Lenore, and Coraline is a dependent child. So her parents, as we can see in the film, they don't have a lot of time for her, so she learns to be dependent and, to live without other people, which is an important life skill to be dependent. So in terms of differences, like I mentioned, some of the themes and messages are the same in both, but it's also important to note that there are some differences. So like I mentioned as well, The Raven is about grief, and it's the internal battle of overcoming the death of somebody that he loved. So Coraline doesn't actually directly face the emotions of grief and, the intensity and severity of impact and the emotions. Can also be said that there is more emphasis placed in Coraline on supernatural elements. So the supernatural elements in the Raven is that the Raven is talking and, he's hearing things, and it's just all to do with insanity. But rather in Coraline, she actually finds a whole universe that brings out the message of supernatural, because rather than just the Raven being able to talk and hearing things that is just to do with insanity, Coraline actually finds a whole new altered world. So yeah, I think that there's more emphasis on supernatural elements in Coraline. Okay, so that does conclude my presentation. There are the sources that I used, and yeah, thank you for listening.